Okay, hi. I want to talk to you about something that's going to be a little bit complicated today, which is the relationship between slavery, race, and racism. I'm going to be looking at three big questions, which are, number one, what is racism and what kind of problem does it pose? Number two, what is the relationship between the history of slavery and the problem of racism? And three, how did American slavery come to be a racial system in the first place? What I'd like you to take away from this video is the idea that those questions, asked in that order, can lead you to a big truth about America's centuries-long problem with race, and that truth is this. Racism, as we understand it, exists because of the desire to protect slavery. Think about that for a second. It might sound backwards to you. I know I thought, when I was younger, that the reason people allowed slavery to exist must have been that they held wrong, racist views about black people. But the truth is, it's the other way around. People adopted wrong racist views because they wanted to own slaves. So let's start with the first question. Number one, what is racism and what kind of a problem does it pose? I think most people's instinctive answer to this question is that racism is the attitude of a person who hates people who are racially different from himself or herself, and the problem it poses is that that person becomes dangerous to the people he or she hates. An even bigger problem, according to this theory, would be that if there were lots of racists, because then they'd all be dangerous to the people they irrationally hate. This theory of racism can be really satisfying because all one has to do to be on the right side of the am I racist or not divide is not hate people based on their race, which isn't hard to do. But the problem is, that's not how I would define racism. Racism, in my view, is a system of stereotypes, disadvantages, and privileges that allow white people to maintain social control, cultural control, and political and economic dominance over all other races, particularly black people in America. This definition is a bit tougher because it doesn't depend on individual prejudices. A person who sincerely believes in racial equality, but still benefits from the advantages that come from being white, is participating in racism, even if they don't intend to. Understanding racism as a system, however, helps explain some of the ways in which race remains a major problem in this country. These problems have less to do with lynching, cross-burning, and Jim Crow laws, and more to do with the way racism has divided people of different races. Here are a few examples, focusing just on black and white people for simplicity. Again, what I'm trying to do is show patterns of discrimination in American culture. So one pattern or problem is wealth. In this country, many black people earn less money than white people. In fact, all of them do on average. Worse, the wealth of black people is massively lower than the wealth of white people. This is in large part because of factors like which families have historically owned expensive houses or inherited wealth, and those factors are heavily influenced by race. Here's another one. The odds of a black man spending time in prison during his life are around 1 in 3 in America. This, again, is the result of patterns in the criminal justice system. For example, our criminal justice system discriminates at every level, from how often people are stopped by police to how often people are arrested and convicted, and also in terms of what kind of sentences people get when they are convicted of a crime. Lately, we've seen a lot of news about police violence, which is one way it's easy to see racism in our time. But the truth is that racism, that system of prejudice, disadvantage, and privilege, is so embedded in our culture that its effects are everywhere and can sometimes be hard to see. Racism is such a problem that it creates a moral obligation on all of us to act to counteract it, and that begins by knowing what it is and where it came from. And where it came from is our history of slavery. This is part of what the author William Faulkner meant when he wrote, "The past isn't dead. It isn't even past." In a very real way, American history is always happening to us, whether we notice it or not. Let's talk about question 2. What is the relationship between the history of slavery and the problem of racism? Well, like I said, the relationship is that slavery created racism as we know it. Let's go back a step. Prejudice against people of different skin colors, cultures, and religion was nothing new by the time slavery began in America in the 17th century. But modern racism, the particular set of attitudes, disadvantages, and privileges that continue to bedevil America, that got its start as the people who ran the institution began to notice the contradiction between what slavery was, a life of permanent forced labor based on skin color for a whole group of people and all of their descendants, and the basic promise of America, which is that all men are created equal and that they have a right to life, liberty, and property. The whole foundation of America is based on this idea, and if enslaved people were people, that meant that slavery was clearly wrong. People definitely understood this contradiction at the time. David Walker, in his Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, for example, wrote, "See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear your languages, proclaim to the world, July 4th, 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed, by their Creator, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders." Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner who had at least 6 mixed-race children by Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, and the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence also understood this contradiction. He said, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, and self-preservation on the other." This acknowledgement of slavery as a necessary evil, however, wasn't good enough for white slave owners in the South, who by the 1830s needed arguments beyond their own self-interest to justify their behavior in the face of abolitionists like Walker, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and all the rest. The Atlantic slave trade was banned by Congress in 1808. England declared slavery immoral and abolished it in all of its colonies in 1833. Southern slave owners needed to be able to call slavery not a necessary evil, but a positive good in order to defend the practice. The South's answer to this problem, how do we call slavery a positive good, was paternalism. The idea that the white race had a collective responsibility to manage the black race in the way that a stern father has an obligation to manage an unruly child. Slavery was good, they argued, because black people were intellectually inferior, naturally lazy, inclined to lie and steal, and mostly interested only in their own immediate comfort and happiness. Frederick Law Olmsted records a Southerner who owned no slaves, explaining the necessity of slavery like this: "Wouldn't do no good to free 'em, because they is so monstrous lazy. If they hadn't got nobody to take care on 'em, you see, they wouldn't do nothing but just naturally laze around and steal and pilfer, and no man could live, you see, where they was. If they was free, no man could live. Now, suppose they was free. You'd see they'd all think themselves just as good as we. How would you like to have stepping up to your darter? Of course you wouldn't." This idea, the South believed, was supported by both the Bible, which defends slavery in several passages and contains a story about a curse on Ham, one of Noah's sons, that was said to be the original justification for slavery. They also used science. For example, Samuel George Morton argued that people of different races were actually different species, and tried to prove this by arguing that the brain cavities of different races are characteristically different. They're not, of course, but people believed this. Another scientist like Morton, Dr. Samuel Cartwright of New Orleans, claimed that, quote, "It is the defective atmospherization of the blood, conjoined with a deficiency of cerebral matter in the cranium, that is the true cause of that debasement of mind which has rendered the people of Africa unable to take care of themselves." Unable to take care of themselves. To maintain this fiction, laws were passed throughout the South, outlawing abolitionist ideas and writings. This change happened quickly. In 1827, there were 106 abolition societies in the South. 10 years later, there were none. University professors who publicly considered abolishing slavery were fired. Elijah Lovejoy, who tried to publish an anti-slavery newspaper in the South, was murdered and his press destroyed in 1837. In addition, a new wave of slave codes were passed throughout the South, making it harder to free an enslaved person, limiting freedom of religion and assembly, restricting movement, and making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. Writings about the management of enslaved people between 1840 and 1860 stressed the importance of taking good care of slaves as a matter of honor and practicality, but also the need to quash any sense of independence enslaved people might feel. It is this idea, paternalism, combined with the white Southerners' sense of a right to absolute power over the enslaved population, that laid the groundwork for modern racism. But let's go back one more step to question 3. Why was slavery a racial system in the first place? The answer to that question goes back to another basic premise of the United States, which is that unlike Europe, the United States was a place where land was cheap and easy to get, while people to work the land were expensive and hard to get. Settling all the land Europeans claimed required workers, and these people had to come from somewhere. In the 17th century, most of them came from Europe as indentured servants. This meant that, either by choice or as a sentence for a crime, people were bound for a term of years, usually less than 7, to serve a master. Afterward, they would be free. There were other options, however, including using captured American Indians as slave labor and importing Africans as slaves. The first option didn't work well, because it angered local Indian societies and led to armed conflict, and because enslaved Indians found it easy to escape slavery. Africans, however, had no natural allies in the New World and were easier to control. They could also be enslaved for life, and laws were passed to make freedom harder to obtain. In 1662, Virginia passed a law saying that any child of a slave mother would also be a slave. In 1664, another law clarified that race, not religion, determined slave status. So becoming a Christian didn't mean that you were automatically free. These rules, taken together, created a permanent difference between black slaves and all other laborers in the colonies. This difference was cemented in 1676, when a small army of indentured servants and black slaves in Virginia, led by Nathaniel Bacon, marched on Jamestown, Virginia, burned the town, and expelled the governor of the colony. More frightening to the wealthier members of Virginia society than the violence itself was their inability to defend against a multiracial, angry workforce whose members saw their interests as being virtually identical. So, the wealthier land-holding members of the Virginia colony decided to divide this population in order to conquer them. Blacks who participated in the rebellion were given far worse punishments than whites, and new laws were passed restricting the behavior of black slaves and easing restrictions on white indentured servants. This distinction created the necessary divide. White workers would always understand that no matter their poverty, they would always be in a better position than black slaves. This is what some sociologists refer to and historians refer to as a racial bribe. This feeling of superiority, over time, would allow the majority of Southern whites, who owned no slaves even in 1860, to feel that maintaining slavery was important to establishing their freedoms. So, to sum all of this up, racism is a system, not the product of individual hatreds, and it's still a major problem in our society today. The roots of this racism come from efforts to justify and strengthen slavery in the face of the obvious tension between slavery and American notions about human rights. And the reason that race became a dividing line in the first place is that it turned out to be the simplest way to provide labor for wealthy white farmers while keeping poor white farmers placated. The need for slavery created the need for the idea of race. The idea of race created the need for the idea of racism, and racism has remained a persistent problem in American society to this day. So that's my story for today. Thanks for listening.